Hey everyone, my name is Kelly. I hope that you guys are doing well and ready for some Excel tricks. The main purpose of my videos is to help you guys increase your efficiency and productivity when it comes to using Excel. If you like my video, I do encourage you to click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. Today's video is an Excel tutorial on the lookup functions. To begin with, I will summarize the use of each function before showing you guys an example. The HLOOKUP function looks in the top row of an array and returns the value of the indicated cell. In other words, the HLOOKUP will search for a value within a table or a dataset that is set up horizontally. The VLOOKUP function looks in the first column of an array and moves across the row to return the value of a cell. In other words, the VLOOKUP will search for a value within a table or a dataset that is set up vertically. Before that I start explaining the lookup function, I think that it is important to understand the limitations of both the HLOOKUP and the VLOOKUP. For the HLOOKUP, it cannot search for a value that is on top of its lookup value. For the VLOOKUP, it cannot search for a value that is on the left of its lookup value. The solution is simple. You can simply use the lookup function. It looks up values in a vector or array. In other words, the lookup function will search for a value within a table or a dataset at the same position but within another column or row. Let's now look at the formula structure. These lookup functions keep a similar format. There is no real difference between the HLOOKUP and the VLOOKUP. For the lookup function, you need to specify the column or row in which your lookup value will be found, and you need to specify the column or row which holds the value that you want to find. This way, you can search for a value that is anywhere in the worksheet. The benefit of this function is that even if you add or delete a column or row, it will not affect your outcome. The reason is that you have specified that column or row. When you use the HLOOKUP or the VLOOKUP, you will need to adjust the column or row index number. This can become an inconvenience as it can take time to identify the issue. The other formula structure for the lookup function is to specify the array. The outcome value is the value that is in the last column or row of the array. This way, you can only search for a value that is either to the right or to the bottom of the lookup value. We will now apply our knowledge to some examples. To start off, we will look at the HLOOKUP and the VLOOKUP function, as they are quite similar. In the first example, my lookup value will be the order ID. I first want to identify the customer ID that corresponds to the order ID. For the HLOOKUP, I will need to identify my lookup value as being the order ID of 103,800, then my table, then the row index number, which in this case would be 2. Then I would select the option false as I want to find the exact match. I am not interested in finding the approximate match. For the VLOOKUP, I would basically need to do the same thing. The only difference is that instead of finding the row index number, I would need to find the column index number, which in this case would be 2. In both examples, I would get a customer ID of DP 1300. When we look at the table, I should have obtained DP 1300. If I would want to identify the sales amount of the order, I would basically need to do the same steps. For the HLOOKUP, I would need to identify the lookup value, the table, the row index number, which in this case would be 4, and then choose the option false. For the VLOOKUP, I would basically need to do the same thing, except that I would choose a column index number of 4. In both cases, I would obtain a sales value of 250.45. As you may have observed, the main difference between the HLOOKUP and the VLOOKUP is that one table is on the horizontal, while the other table is on the vertical. Now, for my second example, My lookup value will be the customer ID. I want to identify the order ID that corresponds to the customer ID. For the HLOOKUP, I need to identify the lookup value, the table, the row index number, which in this case would be 1, and then choose the option false. This would give me an order ID of NA. Why? As previously mentioned, when you use the HLOOKUP, you need to make sure that the data in which you want to find is located beneath the lookup value. If we do the same for the VLOOKUP, the only thing that I would need to change in the formula is to replace the row index number for the column index number, which in this case would still be 1. Again, I would obtain a order ID of NA. Why? The data in which I would want to find is located to the left of the lookup value. Now, let's look at the lookup function. In my first example, my lookup value will be the order ID. I first want to identify the customer ID that corresponds to the order ID. I will need to write lookup, identify my lookup value, which would be the order ID of 103,800, then the lookup vector, which is the column or row in which holds my lookup value, then the result vector, which is a column or row which holds the data in which I want to find that corresponds to my lookup value. As you saw, I did an example in a vertical table. So if you would want to do the same but in a horizontal table, it would look like the following. If I would want to identify the sales amount of the order, I would basically need to do the same steps. I would identify my lookup value, the lookup vector holding my lookup value, and finally the result vector which holds the data that I want to find which corresponds to my lookup value. I would obtain a sales value of 250.45. Now, for my second example, my lookup value will be the customer ID. I want to identify the order ID that corresponds to the customer ID. I would write lookup, then identify my lookup value, then the lookup vector which holds my lookup value, and finally the vector result which holds the data in which I want to find which corresponds to my lookup value. As you can see, I was able to obtain a value, even though that the data was on the left. I do not obtain an NA like I did when I did use the VLOOKUP. The lookup function is the most dynamic compared to the other functions. The reason being is that when you add or delete columns or rows, you do not need to make any kind of modification to the formula. But when you use the HLOOKUP or the VLOOKUP and you add or delete columns or rows, then you are required to make a change in the column or row index number in order to obtain the same outcome. To conclude, using these functions on a regular basis will help increase your efficiency while using Excel. I do hope that this video was helpful. I have made other videos which explain different Excel functions. I do encourage you to view them, especially if you want to learn more about Excel.